On the night of November 9, 1989, civilians climbed atop a concrete barrier that severed their city for decades and swung sledgehammers into the stone. A few feet away, armed East German guards, men who had operated under strict shoot-to-kill orders for decades, did nothing. They stood by and watched the crowds completely overrun the border. In a single evening, without a shot being fired, the most heavily fortified physical barrier in Europe began to disappear. To understand why this barrier fell, we have to look back at its origin as a measure designed to save a state from a total workforce crisis. In 1945, following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Allied powers carved the country into distinct occupation zones, the Democratic West and the Soviet-controlled East. This map of post-World War II Germany shows the geopolitical anomaly of Berlin. The capital city was split in half, but it sat entirely within Soviet territory, making West Berlin an isolated island of capitalism surrounded by a communist state. Over the next decade, living standards sharply diverged. As this data overlay shows, 3.5 million skilled workers, doctors, engineers, and teachers drained out of East Germany, crossing the open border into the West Berlin enclave. Facing the prospect of economic failure, East German leader Walter Albrecht and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly drafted a plan to seal the border, codenamed Operation Rose. On Sunday morning, August 13, 1961, Berliners awoke to find their streets severed by barbed wire, torn up asphalt, and heavily armed troops overseeing the construction of a permanent barricade. The German Democratic Republic claimed this barrier would protect its citizens from Western fascists. In reality, the state had built a prison to keep its own citizens from leaving. This 155-kilometer fortification was a multi-layered complex widely called the Death Strip. Hidden within this illuminated sandy expanse were specific lethal mechanisms. Guards on these paths operated under explicit shoot-to-kill orders, aided by tripwires, blaring alarms, and steel spikes concealed beneath the grass. The state complemented these physical barriers with the surveillance of the Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. The Stasi utilized electronic bugging, blackmail, and a vast network of civilian informants to monitor the population, turning the country into a state where citizens lived in fear of their own neighbors. By combining the physical imprisonment of the death strip with the psychological pressure of the Stasi, the state maintained absolute control over its people. At the macro level, this border served as the primary flashpoint of the Cold War. In October 1961, a dispute at Checkpoint Charlie escalated into a 16-hour standoff, with American and Soviet tanks facing each other at point-blank range. Western leaders used the city to declare democratic solidarity. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy stood before a massive crowd of Berliners to deliver his declaration, Ich bin ein Berliner. But high-stakes diplomacy offered no comfort on the ground. At border crossings like the Palace of Tears, families endured permanent separations. The human toll was on full display in August 1962, when an 18-year-old bricklayer named Peter Fechter was shot trying to scale the wall. He fell back into the death strip, crying for help for nearly an hour, while East German guards refused him aid, bleeding to death as the Western press watched helplessly. Superpower leaders treated the divided city as a geopolitical chessboard, but ordinary citizens paid the bloody price for the lines drawn on that board. Totalitarian architecture invited human defiance. Almost immediately, Berliners began engineering risky ways to bypass the fortifications. In one instance, a young Austrian named Heinz Meixner removed the windshield of a convertible sports car, allowing him to duck and drive straight underneath the border barriers before guards could react. In 1979, two families painstakingly stitched together 60 pieces of canvas and bedsheets to construct a homemade hot air balloon, lifting 4 adults and 4 children over the border in the dead of night. Other citizens ziplined from rooftops, navigated the river in miniature submarines, or dug secret, cramped tunnels beneath the death strip. The state continuously upgraded its lethal infrastructure to plug these holes, yet it could never outpace the human drive for freedom. By the late 1980s, the Soviet bloc was fracturing. Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a loophole for East Germans to flee, while protesters marched in the streets of Leipzig and Berlin. International pressure mounted. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan issued a public challenge at the Brandenburg Gate, demanding the Soviets tear the wall down. The breaking point arrived on the evening of November 9, 1989, during a televised press conference held by East German spokesman Günter Schabowski. Handed a confusing note about new travel regulations, Schabowski mistakenly announced that citizens could now cross the border. When a reporter asked when the rule took effect, he fumbled his words and replied, "Immediately, without delay." Within hours, tens of thousands of East Berliners surged to the checkpoints. Decades of meticulous state control collapsed in an instant due to a panicked bureaucratic error. The scenes that night were chaotic. Overwhelmed guards yielded their posts. Strangers from east and west embraced in the streets, and loudspeakers played Beethoven's Ninth Symphony across the checkpoints. Germany was formally reunified in October 1990, and heavy machinery was brought in to lift the concrete slabs away, clearing the horizon. Erasing the physical barrier proved easier than erasing the psychological one. For decades after, Germans spoke of the Mauer im Kopf, the wall in the head, a lingering cultural and economic rift dividing East and West. Today, the preserved fragments of concrete stand as scars. They memorialize the 138 people who died trying to cross, and serve as a permanent reminder that freedom is indivisible.